This is the Detroit Sports Podcast Network.
It's our complete 2019 college football forecast. Next on this week's episode of Michigan Podcast.
But there's going to be one team that's going to play solely as a team. No man is more important than the team. No coach is more important than the team. The team, the team, the team.
Looks deep for Anthony Clark. Waits for it. Hit. Caught.
This is no time for that. In the pocket and a sack. Tim Jamison. Brady gets terrific.
Throws it and a touchdown. Knight again. Schultz just before Brazil got him. And a leaping interception by Woodson.
Harbaugh back to throw over the middle. Caught by Collier at the 5 on his feet. Touchdown, Michigan. On its way. It's good.
He's 5'7", 179 pounds, a junior at Michigan. But Jamie Morris packs a wallop, and he delivers for Bo Schembechler.
And here's your first play. Pressure coming. Sack. It is Glenn Steele, number 81, who fought his way through the traffic.
Option. And Robinson calls his own number, and he's going to score. Oh, an easy touchdown for Robinson and Michigan.
Win it. We're going to win the championship again because we're going to play as a team. And when we play as a team and the old season is over, you and I know it's going to be Michigan again. Michigan.
Go Blue, and welcome to this week's episode of Michigan Podcast. I'm Steve Deace. Well, it is almost the most wonderful time of the year. The college football season is upon us. In less than 40 days, we get our very first game, kicking off the 150th commemorative year. Florida against Miami at the Citrus Bowl in Orlando will get us all started on Saturday afternoon, August the 24th. Well, if you just can't wait, if you were the kind of kid that had to peek under the Christmas tree and sneak around because you just couldn't wait to unwrap the presents to find out what you got this year, I've got good news for you, because this year we've got the forecast of what is coming throughout the course of the next few months. What could the end of the college football season look like, and thus leading into the postseason? We're going to begin our preview episode with my forecast of what I think the college football rankings will look like, the playoff rankings, that is, when the regular season ends after conference championship weekend. Let's start by taking a look at some of the teams that I think will be in the conversation or thereabouts throughout the course of the year of being ranked, but will not finish in the final college football playoff rankings top 25. Some of those teams include, for example, from the Big Ten, you'll notice Purdue, Northwestern, Penn State, Iowa. I have a lot of those teams clustered there. From the ACC, Virginia Tech, and Pittsburgh and Syracuse. Some of those teams clustered there. For Group of 5 teams, well, Florida State's an ACC team as well. For Group of 5 teams, San Diego State and Boise State, and then TCU and Baylor from the Big 12, Washington State from the Pac-12. Those are the teams that I think will be ranked maybe during courses of the season, hovering around the rankings throughout much of the year. But when it is all said and done, and the playoff committee comes out of their meeting room, and reverse engineers ranks the college football teams 1 through 25. I think those teams, despite having good seasons, will be left out. Now we get to the 25 teams that I think we will see at the end of the year. And we start with the Army Cadets. Last year, it was expected to be a step back for Army with the departure of Ahmad Bradshaw, but Kelvin Hopkins stepped in at quarterback and did a masterful job running that triple option for the Black Knights. I like Nebraska to finish at the bottom of the top 25. I am optimistic optimistic, but not nearly as much as, say, Phil Steele, who has them going to the Rose Bowl. I still think they've got some work to do in the lines. As well as on defense, but this is one of the more favorable schedules in the country. I think Nebraska beats Iowa at the end of the year and gets into the top 25. Now, if Iowa wins that game, then I think you pretty much just switch Iowa and Nebraska here. Stanford, I think, pulls the upset over Notre Dame in Palo Alto. The Irish have never won on the farm since Brian Kelly became head coach, and that'll be enough to get them to around 8 wins and a spot in the top 25. Missouri is a team that I think will win its NCAA appeal, have its postseason status restored, and they have a schedule tailor-made to win 8 or 9 games, and I think they go about 9-3 and finish somewhere in the top 25. And then Iowa State, this is a unique Iowa State team. They're probably the strongest in the trenches. They've been as long as I can remember. In my rankings of the top talent in the Big 12, the top 5 defensive players in the Big 12 all played for Iowa State. Now, the question is, what are they going to do without Hakeem Butler and David Montgomery, who were their 2 key playmakers a year ago? Even with the improved recruiting under Matt Campbell, you just don't instantly replace explosive talent like that in Ames. And so while they're stronger in the trenches, while they're good enough on defense to win the Big 12, I'm not sure they're explosive enough on offense to do it. The next tier of teams that I think we will see at the end of the year in the college football playoff rankings, I think USC, if they can survive a brutal opening month to the season in September, there's a lot more wins on the backside of that schedule. And I think they have a ton of talent to run that new air raid offense that they're switching to with Graham Harrell, the new offensive coordinator. Minnesota, if you were watching last week's Crystal Ball, you know I am crystal balling them to win the Big Ten West, and so that's why they are there at number 19. Auburn at number 18. They have the 11th most talented roster in my power ratings, but that schedule, it was like Vladimir Putin and his Russian troll bot eggs made Auburn's schedule absolutely brutal. You're already playing LSU, Mississippi State, Alabama, Texas A&M in your own division, and then you have to play Florida and Georgia, the top 2 teams in the East, in your crossover games. Now you're adding Oregon out of the Pac-12, who's going to be ranked pretty high here in a few minutes. To open up the non-conference, I don't know how Auburn, even if they have a really good year, but you're playing with freshman quarterbacks, I don't know how they get out of that with fewer than 4 losses. So I have the Tigers pegged 8-4, even though the talent is better. I've got Miami at number 17. The Hurricanes, stop me if you've heard this one before. Everything else is in place if they could only find a quarterback. This was a program that once had Jim Kelly, Bernie Kosar, and Vinny Testaverde on the roster at the same time. Once had Bernie Kosar, Vinny Testaverde, Craig Erickson on the roster at the same time. Hell, one year in 1992, we couldn't think of who to get a Heisman Trophy to, so we're like, who's playing quarterback for Miami? Give it to him. Gino Torretta, it's yours. I mean, this was the ultimate quarterback when we were kids, but it's become a tradition unlike any other as of late. Miami searching for a quarterback. They're hoping Ohio State, former Ohio State prep star recruit Tate Martell, who transferred in the spring, they're hoping he might finally be their answer. At number 16 in those rankings, I like the Washington Huskies. I'm going to be fascinated to see the marriage between Chris Peterson, who's a by-the-book percentage guys. He likes high-efficiency quarterbacks, but he's bringing in a true gunslinger and Georgia transfer Jacob Eason, the son of Tony Eason. You might have once seen him get sodomized by the Chicago Bears in a brutal Super Bowl. Let's get to the top 15 teams that I think we will see in the college football playoff rankings at the end of the year. I think for the 3rd year in a row, the Central Florida Knights will represent the group of 5 in the New Year's 6 Bowls, but I think they will lose a couple of games, a tougher non-conference slate for Central Florida. Their quarterback with Dylan Mack's injury is going to be former Notre Dame quarterback Brandon Winbush, and I have the Irish at number 14. Now, if I'm wrong, if Notre Dame goes to Stanford and wins, you move Notre Dame up a few spots, and they end up in the New Year's 6 Bowls. I like their team. It looks a lot like last year's team. Defensive front, not quite as stout without Jerry Tillery, but really good on the edges. Offensive line is still pretty good. Ian Book is, a very strong, efficient quarterback. I think Jafar Armstrong will fill in nicely as the new tailback there. I just think the schedule is tougher for Notre Dame, especially the road games at Georgia, at at Michigan, and then at Stanford. I've got Michigan State number 13. You'll recall last year I was not as high on Michigan State as a lot of the pundits were. I was concerned about their depth. This year I am higher on Michigan State than most of the pundits are. Maybe the best front seven in all of college football. Certainly the nastiest north of Baton Rouge or Tuscaloosa. I think the schedule is favorable. The non-conference game with Arizona State is at home this time. And Brian Lewerke, if he's healthy, can't be anywhere near what he was last year. Maybe he won't be as good as he was in 2017, but given how good that defense is, if he's 50% better, somewhere between 2017 and 2018. So meet him halfway. That's a team that's going to win probably around 9 games. At number 12 in my forecast, I think the Florida Gators will finish there at the end of the year, somewhere around a 9-3 record. They lost a lot, but they've got replacements where guys were lost, like they lost Shakai Polite, but you got Jabari Zuniga there to come off the edge. My biggest concern with the Gators, when you're replacing virtually your entire offensive line, and you're only in the second year of a new coach, which means he's not built that offensive line pipeline yet, where guys he recruited and developed over the course of 2 or 3 years are now ready to walk in and assume that mantle. It's only the second year for Dan Mullen, and so they're going to cobble together an offensive line, mostly with players that he did not recruit or pick to be in his program. That's my only real concern with the Gators. And finishing out, before we get to the top 10, number 11, Texas A&M. I've got them with the 10th most overall talented roster in the country. Another team, though, playing a very difficult schedule. This is probably a 2020 team from a playoff perspective. I expect for them to challenge for the playoff next year, but I still think there's enough talent. You still have a great coach in Jimbo Fisher. Kellen Mond really developed as the year went on at quarterback. Still enough for them to be a team that gets into the New Year's Six. And now, the top 10. These are the teams that I think will be ranked in the top 10 when the College Football Playoff Committee gives its final verdict at the end of the regular season, concluding with Conference Championship Weekend. I've got Oregon out of the Pac-12 at number 10. I think the Ducks will beat Auburn on week 1, but will end up being one of those Conference Championship game upsets I forecast in my crystal ball last week. More on that in a moment. Texas I have at number 9. It's getting really fashionable to point out how much Texas lost on defense, and they did lose a lot. And I also think from a playoff perspective, they're a team, much like their in-state peer A&M, better built for 2020. But they are still in the Big 12, folks. They don't play a lot of defense. Outside of Iowa State and TCU, they don't play a lot of defense in that league, and they might have the best quarterback in that league in Sam Ehlinger. So I've got Texas at number 9, and you'll see later that's another conference where I think there will be an upset on championship weekend, meaning I think Oklahoma finishes first in the Big 12, but Texas beats them in the Big 12 championship game. I think the Ohio State Buckeyes finish number 8 in the college football playoff rankings after finally tasting defeat to our beloved Michigan Wolverines. Hey, we beat Ohio State once every 15 years, whether you like it or not. I mean, that's what a rivalry is all about, or something. You win every 15 years or so. But I'm a little concerned about Justin Fields. Didn't play a meaningful snap. Well, he played one meaningful snap for Georgia last year. It was that ill-fated fake punt call by Kirby Smart that may have cost him an SEC title, maybe even a national championship. And now he's coming in with a staff that didn't recruit him in a new system. I think that Ohio State is still a very talented team. But you cannot tell me you're losing maybe the best win percentage in college football history, not named Frank Leahy, for a career in Urban Meyer, and there's no impact at all. The aforementioned Oklahoma Sooners I have at number 7. Love the skill talent. I'm a little concerned about their offensive line, where they're replacing 4 starters after having one of the best offensive lines in college football the last 2 or 3 years. And I think that's more of an issue when Jalen Hurts is your quarterback, because he's going to want to do more of that power running than what you saw from Baker Mayfield and Kyler Murray, who could really sling the rock from inside and outside the pocket. And that's going to require an offensive line now that can move the line of scrimmage. Can they get that from such a young line and a bunch of guys that haven't played together? We shall see. And then at number 6, I like the Utah Utes to upset Oregon in the Pac-12 championship game and make it to their first Rose Bowl as the Pac-12 champs. Typical Kyle Whittingham team with the strength in the trenches and on the defensive side of the ball. But now with a healthy Zach Moss and Tyler Huntley on offense, they've got some playmakers and some explosion there too. So like Utah to win the Pac-12 and end up playing in Pasadena for the first time as a program. Into the top 5 we go. I think LSU finishes at number 5. Only 2 losses I see for the Tigers, one of them to Alabama. I think they beat Texas early in the year and end up being one of the 2 lost teams vying for that final playoff spot, which I think goes to the first 2 lost team to ever make it to the playoffs. I think Michigan beats Ohio State, wins the Big Ten, and with an 11-2 record as the champion of the second best league, gets into the college football playoff where they will play number 1 Georgia. I think finally the Dogs, after 2 near misses in heartbreaking fashion to Alabama in a row, finally the Padawan beats the Jedi Master. Nick Saban finally loses a game to a former assistant in Kirby Smart of Georgia, and I think Clemson, Alabama round out the playoffs. I don't think Clemson is nearly as good as they were a year ago. They lost more offseason attrition than any team in my total team talent ratings, but they still have an Andrew Luck level of talent at quarterback and Trevor Lawrence. They still have good skill players. They've got 4 offensive linemen returning as starters to protect him. And the ACC, I mean, you can spin the wheel of destiny to name who their second best team is. And then I think Alabama's roster is absolutely loaded, as it always is. And then you throw in, now Nick Saban doesn't have to contrive controversy. You know, last year he was literally asking the media to stop writing good things about his team, concerned about complacency. Well, after the way they face-palmed and got face-planted in the national championship game, and after seeing doubts about Alabama creep in for the first time in many years over the last 8 months, I think Nick Saban's got all the motivational ploy he needs to refocus his team. So I think your college football playoff is Georgia versus Michigan in one game, Alabama versus Clemson in the other. We'll tell you how those pairings will work with the bowl projections coming up later on in this week's episode. But next, we're going to go conference by conference and forecast how each of these leagues will finish this fall. Stay tuned. Now that football season is here, it's a great time to support Michigan Podcast via Patreon. We'd love to get over 100 patrons on Patreon by the time the season kicks off on August the 31st. And there's 3 ways that you can support us on Patreon. If you pledge $1 a month, that's just a great way, if you like our content, just to say thank you for putting this together for you all across the maize and blue landscape all year long. If you are in our exclusive club for $5 or more per month, then you get exclusive content. Like you can see, I recently posted my bestest bets for the college football season win totals in 2019. We will also have exclusive instant reaction podcast after games and other content that we set aside, like my point spread picks and others that we do for those of you that are supporting us at $5 a month. And then if you'd like to join our booster club, that's $25 or more a month. You also get your name and business mentioned in the credits, a shout out in the show as well. So a way to promote any message that you have, you know, with some standards around here, obviously, or a business that you'd like us to promote for you as well, for just being a booster for $25 or more per month. And thank you to all of you that have been supporting us all year long as we head into our 3rd season on Michigan Podcast. Back here on Michigan Podcast as we roll on with our 2019 preview / forecast for the upcoming season. And now let's take a look at how I forecast each of college football's major conferences to finish this season, beginning with the ACC. Now, here is a spreadsheet I put together for every conference, and I assess every team. The depth factor there is their total team, where they rank in their conference, and my total team talent ratings. The coaching factor there is where they rank in my coaching power ratings. You guys, if you watch this on a regular basis or listen to the podcast, you've seen those numbers before. And then I rank you against the rest of the teams in your conference at quarterback, running back, wide receivers, and tight ends go together as pass catchers. Offensive line, defensive line, linebacker, defensive back, special teams. Conference road schedule is what CRS stands for. The easier your conference road schedule, vis-a-vis the talent you have on hand, the higher the score. And then I get a total. For the ACC, Notre Dame is included with this league since about a third, a little more than a third of its schedule is against ACC opponents. And so as you can see on that board there, I have Clemson heads and shoulders above every other team in the ACC. In fact, if you take Notre Dame out, I mean, I've got Clemson a good more than 30 points ahead of what would be the second best team in the completed Atlantic Coast Conference, Miami of Florida. So how does this then relate to how I forecast things to go in the ACC? These are what I believe will be the standings at the end of the year. I think Miami just edges out Virginia, Pittsburgh, and Virginia Tech in the Coastal. I think Clemson runs away with the Atlantic. Florida State and Syracuse are several games behind, along with NC State. I think Clemson beats Miami in the ACC championship game for the second time in 3 years. You look at your all-ACC team, and you're going to see a lot of Clemson players on that team. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 on the offense, for example. Then you look on the defensive side of the ball, and even with a rebuilt defense, you can see there's still 2 Clemson players on that team. There you see Syracuse, though, with a couple of key guys, including Alton Robinson up front. So they've got a good defensive front, and that's usually a position that signifies you're going to have a successful season come the fall. And now the honor roll in the ACC. I think Trevor Lawrence, no surprise, wins Offensive Player of the Year. I think Shaquille Quarterman, linebacker of Miami, is the Defensive Player of the Year. The aforementioned Alton Robinson of Syracuse, I think, will be the Lineman of the Year. Wisconsin transfer Alex Hornibrook. Well, I think he'll be the Offensive Newcomer of the Year as the quarterback now for Florida State. Coach of the Year, I think it's going to be Manny Diaz at Miami. I think Dave Clawson at Wake Forest is the coach most likely to be fired. The Game of the Year, I think, is Virginia at Miami. I think it will decide that division. I think the Conference Upset of the Year, I think Mac Brown wins a big in-state rivalry game his first year at North Carolina. I think Texas A&M beats Clemson. That is Clemson's only loss of the year. The Aggies go down to Death Valley after getting a near miss against Clemson last year and get Jimbo Fisher a signature win. The best non-conference win, I think, will be Florida State over Boise State. And if I were buying stock in ACC teams, I'd buy Florida State because it's at a record low. You'll never get Florida State stock any lower than it is right now, so it's a good value. And I'd sell high on Duke, given what they lost since last season. The next league we're going to take a look at now. Let's go over to the Big 12 Conference, and here is the spreadsheet where you can see it is neck and neck between Oklahoma and Texas for who is the best team in my Big 12 power ratings. And then there's a bit of a gap. And you can see Iowa State and TCU are really close, and Oklahoma State not too far behind, with Baylor, Kansas State, Texas Tech, West Virginia, and no surprise, Kansas in last place. So with those numbers in mind, I forecast the season in the Big 12 to finish this way. Oklahoma and Texas is the top 2 teams in the league. Oklahoma has the more favorable schedule, so I think they finish first in the conference standings, but I think in the Big 12 championship, Texas defeats Oklahoma in the rematch. And I think TCU, Iowa State, Baylor, those all look like 8-4 kind of football teams to me. When you start looking at the all Big 12 team, and you can see on the offensive side of the ball, Oklahoma, when it comes to skill talent, is absolutely loaded again. But Texas, for the first time, probably since the Colt McCoy days, with the all Big 12 quarterback heading into the year. On the defensive side of the ball, I mentioned all those players for Iowa State, and there you can see them. 5 Iowa State Cyclones on the all Big 12 defensive team, and not a one of them is a reach. So that's about as loaded, given the way they recruit and the way they have to recruit at Iowa State. That's about as loaded as an Iowa State defense could possibly be. And it'll be interesting now to see how it stacks up against the Big 12, those Big 12 offenses over the course of a 9-game schedule. Our Big 12 on a roll. We think Sam Ehlinger of Texas will be the Big 12 Player of the Year on offense. Jaquan Bailey of Iowa State, though, on the defensive side of the ball. And we think he's going to be the Lineman of the Year, too. Jalen Hurts, the Alabama transfer, is the Offensive Newcomer of the Year at Oklahoma. Oquan Mathis, an edge player for TCU. They lost 2 of those guys to the NFL draft. I think he is the Defensive Newcomer of the Year. I like what Matt Rule at Baylor is building. That's a 2020 team to keep your eye on. I think he's the Coach of the Year this year. I think the Game of the Year, no surprise, and we're going to continue to call it the Red River Shootout, no matter how much you may find that offensive. Conference upset of the year. We like Baylor to give Oklahoma its only conference loss in Waco. We think West Virginia upsets NC State for the non-conference upset of the year. And we think the best non-conference win will be Iowa State over Iowa. Matt Campbell has done almost everything you can do at Iowa State except beat Iowa. We think he finally gets off the schneid this fall. If we were buying stock in Big 12 teams, we'd buy Baylor with a good price point at the moment, buy them low, and we'd sell West Virginia high, given the coaching change and all the attrition that they had there during the offseason. League number 3, we're going to take a look at. We'll keep close to home here. Let's go to the Big Ten and take a look at the spreadsheet we have on the Big Ten teams. And you'll see that it's pretty close between Ohio State and Michigan for 1-2. And then there's a bit of a gap, not as big as the gap in the Big 12, but a bit of a gap between them and Michigan State, Penn State. And now look at the Big Ten West. Iowa, Minnesota, Northwestern, Purdue, Nebraska. Those 6 teams in the Big Ten West, in my power ratings in that spreadsheet, are within 13 points of one another. That to quantify that for you, that's like they're 1 or 2 player injuries away from either winning the division or finishing in 6th place in that division. So that race is going to be fun because those teams are all better, I think, than they were a year ago, with the possible exception of Northwestern. If Hunter Johnson lives up to the recruiting hype, I think Northwestern can be better than they were last year. They got almost every key piece back on defense. They've got Bowser, the tailback, back. If you have a quarterback with some next level ability and a friendlier schedule than the one they had last year, then I think it's possible the top 6 teams in the Big Ten West are all improved over a year ago, which is going to make that race a lot of fun, and also maybe produce a lot of headaches when it comes to time to try to figure out tiebreakers. So how does this mean I forecast Big Ten standings to finish? I don't think anybody gets out of this league with fewer than 2 losses. I've got Michigan and Ohio State at 7-2, but Michigan winning the head-to-head. Michigan State not too far behind. I think Penn State's a 2020 team. And then I think Indiana, Maryland, whoever wins the game between those two is bowl eligible. Right now, I forecast that to be Indiana, but I could go back and forth on that one. In the West Division, I think Minnesota, with the friendly schedule, the good crossover games, and they only play one of the big 3, Michigan, Ohio State, and Penn State. They only play one of them, Penn State, and they get them at home in a game I think they can win. I think Iowa, Nebraska, Wisconsin are all next at 5-4 with Northwestern. Purdue just a game behind at 4-5. So you can see my projections of that division. I mean, everybody is within 2 games. And then Illinois bringing up the rear, but still winning 4 games, which I think they did last year as well. And then I have, in a battle for the Little Brown Jug, although this one takes place in Indianapolis, 2 first-time visitors to the Big Ten championship game. I think Michigan beats Minnesota and wins its first Big Ten title since 2004. But who's counting? Yeah, so am I. Looking at the all Big Ten team this year, I think Shea Patterson is your all Big Ten quarterback. Jonathan Taylor, J.K. Dobbins at tailback. Both of those receivers. Rondale Moore is a stud, but do not sleep on Tyler Johnson. He's really good as well. And then I think you see Michigan with the best offensive line it has had, I think, in more than a decade, with 3 players on my all Big Ten team up front. On the defensive side of the ball, the talent is a lot more spread out, except for that front 7 of Michigan State is well represented there with 3 players. Don't sleep on the front 7 for Penn State, though. That's the strength of their team, and I think it's going to be the best front 7 that Penn State has had since James Franklin took over. The Big Ten honor roll. I think the offensive player of the year will be Shea Patterson in the new offense. I think he's going to break every Michigan passing mark. Defensive player of the year, Kenny Willekes at Michigan State. I think Ben Bredesen of Michigan is the lineman of the year. Justin Fields at Ohio State, the offensive newcomer of the year. George Karlaftis, highly rated defensive player for Purdue. Maybe the best defensive recruit they have signed in many a moon. I think he's the defensive newcomer of the year. I heard Jeff Brom say recently he's already a starter on that side of the ball. PJ Fleck, I have guiding Minnesota to the division title, so he seems like a logical choice for coach of the year. Obviously, Chris Ash, unfortunately, seems to be the coach most likely to be fired. Game of the year, the game. Conference upset of the year, I think Indiana finally gets off the schneid and beats Michigan for the first time since 1987. That game is it couldn't be at a worse time for Michigan. I mean, first of all, the last 2 times we've gone down to Bloomington, it's been triple overtime and overtime. So we already know that is a place where they play their best against us. But now that's the game right after Michigan State and right before Ohio State. That's got sandwich game letdown written all over it. Elsewhere with the Big Ten honor roll, non-conference upset of the year, I think Maryland's going to beat Syracuse to get Mike Loxley his first big win there in College Park. Non-conference win, the best one, I think Michigan beating Notre Dame. That'll be under the lights prime time in October. And if I'm buying stock here, 2019 in the Big Ten, I'm buying low on Minnesota and I'm selling high on Penn State. I think Penn State is a 2020 team. We go now to the Pac-12. There you can see I've got Utah and Oregon in an exact tie in the power ratings. Washington, USC, not too far behind. Stanford, not too far behind. So that's a deeper league than it has been, and it will be, I think, a good race in the Pac-12. I think the league is finally beginning to come back and improve starting this year. I forecast the Pac-12 to end this way. I like Oregon to get off the schneid against Washington finally and win the Pac-12 North. Utah to win the South. But there you can see, I think those races are all really close with several teams within a game or two of one another. And I think Utah beats Oregon in the Pac-12 championship game. The all Pac-12 team, you'll see that there is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 different schools represented in the all Pac-12 offense, which speaks to the fact there's improved depth in this league this fall. On the defensive side of the ball, you'll see Utah has the lion's share of players there. I think they will have the strongest defense in the Pac-12, which isn't a surprise. They've been right up there defensively every year under Kyle Whittingham since they joined the league. My Pac-12 honor roll, I think the offensive player of the year will be Justin Herbert at Oregon. Leke Fotu at Utah will be the defensive player of the year. The lineman of the year, Leke Fotu at Utah again. Offensive newcomer of the year, remember the name, Gage Gubrud at Washington State. I think he will equal Gardner Minshew's numbers, if not his magic. Then you can see, I think, coach of the year. I know a lot of people have Clay Helton fired. I think he's going to lead a rebound this year. I'm going to be the contrarian and go coach of the year, but I could also see him being the coach most likely to be fired as well. Oregon at Washington, an underrated rivalry, is the game of the year. Conference upset of the year, Arizona State has been a burr in the saddle for Washington. I think they get the upset again. Non-conference upset of the year, I think Cincinnati beats UCLA for the second straight season. Oregon beating Auburn week 1, I think will be the league's best non-conference win. And if I were buying stock, I'd buy low on USC. You'll never get USC stock lower than it is right now. So take advantage of the value there. And I'm going to sell high on Arizona State. I think they have a come down after being a surprise a bit and getting to 7 wins in a bowl game in Herm Edwards' first season. And that then leaves us with one final league, the Southeastern Conference. And you can see, again, the race at the top between Alabama and Georgia is pretty competitive. It's not quite as close as it is in the Big Ten, but when you're pulling the point total that Georgia is there, you absolutely could win this league. LSU not too far behind, and then there's a bit of a gap for the next tier where you see Florida, Texas A&M, Auburn, and Missouri. I forecast the SEC to finish this way. I think Alabama is undefeated at the end of the regular season. 8-0, 12-0. I think they will play Georgia in the SEC championship game. I think Tennessee has a bit of a bounce back with a bowl game. I think LSU gets to 10 wins again for the second consecutive season. A&M improves by a game despite an improved roster, but the schedule keeps down how far they can actually rise with their overall record. And I think Florida and Missouri, Florida I think is another 2020 team, and I think Missouri easily gets over its win total. When you look at the SEC, this is the all SEC offense. And you can see, again, a league with a lot of depth. We've got players from Mississippi State there, Missouri there, Vanderbilt there, as well as, your traditional powers that we've already talked about. On the defensive side of the ball, where this league really seems to shine on a perennial basis, Auburn, I think, has maybe the best defensive front in the sport, led by Derek Brown. You look at the linebackers there, Alabama and Mississippi State might have the two best linebacker units in all of college football. And then LSU is a mainstay there, kind of one of the DBUs in the sport. Christian Fulton looks like their next great corner at LSU. Next, we go to the honor roll for the SEC. I think Tua Tagovailoa is your offensive player of the year. I think another Crimson Tide member, Dylan Moses, is your defensive player of the year. Andrew Thomas at Georgia. He could be the first non-quarterback picked in next year's NFL draft. I think he's the lineman of the year. Kelly Bryant at Missouri, I think, is going to have a really good season. The Clemson transfer taking over for Drew Lock at quarterback there in Columbia. Derek Stingley Jr., his dad played in the NFL. I think he is your defensive newcomer of the year for LSU. Kirby Smart at Georgia is your coach of the year. Alabama at Texas A&M. The game of the year. I think the conference upset of the year. Mississippi State catches a napping LSU at home in Stark Vegas. Non-conference upset of the year. A&M beating Clemson. We already talked about that one. I think LSU over Texas is the league's best non-conference win. And if I were buying stock right now in SEC teams, I'd be buying low on Missouri, because I think you're going to get a good appreciative value there. And I'd be selling high on Kentucky. They had their best season since probably in the late 70s a year ago, and they lost a lot of the key players from that team. I don't think they'll fall off the map. Mark Stoops says actually recruited there much better than people think. I still think they'll be a bowl team, but nowhere near as good as last year's team that won 10 games. So that's how we forecast the major conferences to finish in college football. When we return, we put it all together with your postseason forecast. These will be what we think will be the bowl matchups next on Michigan Podcast. Hey, if you want to keep up with what we think about Michigan athletics all week long in between episodes of Michigan Podcast, check out our website at wolverinedigest.com. For example, we've got a brand new story up there looking at all of the potential starting fives in the Big Ten now that Franz Wagner is in the fold for the Wolverines, and you can see where Michigan stacks up against the rest of the conference. There's ways to keep up with our coverage of the football team, basketball. We've added hockey and baseball as well. So a ton of stuff that you can follow along with here. And we have a video each and every morning we put up as a way of just saying kind of good morning and catching you up on whatever the big news was from overnight for the Michigan Wolverines. So you can follow us on the website Recruiting2 at wolverinedigest.com. Back one final time here on this week's episode of Michigan Podcast as we forecast the 2019 college football season. And now that we've shown you what we think will happen during the regular season, let's go even further forward into the postseason. We believe these will be the bowl projections. We'll start with the non-New Year's Six bowls and begin in that tier with some of the better ones, starting with the Citrus Bowl, Michigan State and Florida. You might recall they played in a Citrus Bowl before 20 years ago. That's the game that got Bobby Williams the job when Nick Saban left for LSU. In the Outback Bowl, we think Tennessee plays Nebraska. Boy, with the Tampa Chamber of Commerce. Love to have those two fan bases hanging around over Christmas time. The Sun Bowl, Florida State against USC. It sounds like those two teams should be playing in a bowl game better than El Paso, Texas. In the Holiday Bowl, Iowa and Washington. The Holiday Bowl has been trying to get Iowa in this game for years. This is the last year it's associated with the Big Ten. I think this is the year it finally gets its wish. The Artist, formerly known as the Gator Bowl, the Tax Slayer, Minnesota against Auburn. Iowa State and Oregon, that would definitely be a sellout in the Alamo Bowl. We think since Notre Dame isn't in the New Year's Six, it takes the next spot in the ACC Bowl's allotment and takes on TCU, Mississippi State, Virginia in the Music City Bowl, Kentucky Baylor in the Texas Bowl, Liberty Bowl, Oklahoma State versus South Carolina in the Pinstripe Bowl, Purdue against Syracuse, the Red Box Bowl. This is another game that sounds like it ought to be played in a more prestigious venue or setting. Penn State against Stanford, the Belk Bowl, Virginia Tech against Army, Kansas State, UCLA, and the Cheez-It Bowl. Yes, we have a thing now called the Cheez-It Bowl, folks. The Independence Bowl, Pittsburgh against Louisiana Tech. The Las Vegas Bowl, which is upgrading and joining the Big Ten's bowl roster for next year. San Diego State against Washington State, and then Duke versus Navy in the Military Bowl. And as we look at the second of the second-tier bowl games, a couple of highlights. We have Wisconsin going to the Quick Lane Bowl to take on Boston College. Indiana getting to the First Responders Bowl out of the Big Ten. Where do we have? I think there was a Northwestern. We forgot Northwestern in the Armed Forces Bowl against Air Force. Any other really intriguing matchups there? No. So let's get to the biggies. These will be your New Year's 6 bowl games. We think we start at the bottom. We think Central Florida represents the group of 5 yet again for the 3rd year in a row and takes on the Oklahoma Sooners in the Cotton Bowl at Jerry World. In the Orange Bowl, Miami, as the second team out of the ACC, takes on LSU from the SEC. I don't remember the last time those two teams played. In the Sugar Bowl, the eyes of Texas are upon you. A&M, Texas A&M versus Texas, a renewal of this classic in-state rivalry that hasn't been played since the Big 12, the original Big 12, broke up. In the Rose Bowl, Utah gets there for the first time and takes on the Ohio State University in Ryan Day's first year. And now to the playoff games. In the Fiesta Bowl, number 2 Alabama will host number 3 Clemson. Remember, they played in the semifinals just 2 years ago, in 2017. And then Michigan heads to the Peach Bowl for the 2nd year in a row. Not sure the Wolverines want to revisit that game after what happened to them a year ago. But this time they take on number 1 Georgia in the 2nd of the 2 playoff games. So now there you have it. No need to watch, folks. We saved you all this time, but you know what? I think we're going to watch anyway because this sport is just that much darn fun. Hope you enjoyed it. We'll be back again for another episode of Michigan Podcast next week. We'll take a look at anything noteworthy that came out of Big Ten Media Days, which take place here on Thursday of this week. Until then, don't forget to check us out on WolverineDigest.com every day. Follow us on Twitter at Michigan Podcast. You can also make sure to listen and subscribe and give us 5-star reviews, whether you are doing this on YouTube, Google Play, Stitcher, iTunes. The more of those 5-star reviews we get, the more likes we get, the more people like you we get and find. So we greatly appreciate all of you that have liked and subscribed already. And a special thank you to our friends at Detroit Sports Podcast for helping us to get the word out about this show each and every episode. Until the next time, go Blue.